5 books are called the Pentateuch, or the Law, or simply the Law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then the next 12 books, you know what they're called? Yeah, for all those people who didn't like history, that's what they're called. You know why? Because they're historical. They're simply a writing down of the events that took place. And so that starts out with Joshua and goes through the book of Esther. And probably the 3 less known books in the historical period would be that of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. I believe that's one of the reasons that it is a playground for people who want to come up with these fascinations and fascinating things and ideas. Am I not going to have enough? Not so far. We're going to have to share, it looks like. Anisha, are you going to get me a cup of coffee? Oh, copies. I thought you were going to get me some coffee. I don't know who made that coffee, but it's smelling pretty good. Yes, me. Hey, niece, I think we're going to be okay. You can bring that coffee back. Just kidding. Norman Perry, you and I must go see the brother up the valley who I remembered his name just a moment ago but forgot from the time I walked from the pew up here. You know the man in Whitwell with all the Christmas trees, Jerry? We've got to make that trip, brother. I mean, we've got to do that. You know, I have postponed going to see people. And, you know, something had come up, so I didn't make that as quick as I should have. And then, lo and behold, they leave, you know. But my cousin, I intended to go back and see her and her husband on Monday. And she didn't make it through Sunday. She died Saturday night late, Sunday morning early. And so it's amazing when people get ill, you know, you just don't know. I didn't know Teresa Rogers was that ill. And don't get me wrong, I knew that she was sick. But I did not know that it was that soon. But that's a good family. They live right here on the corner. Notice this first one here. Because of the 12 historical books, these are probably the 3 least studied. And look at this one right here. This one, this is just simply, now, when it comes to dates in the Old Covenant, don't get yourself beat up if you read one guy who says one thing, another guy who says another, and they're just a few years apart. That's real common. Historical records, some take more stock in what sectarian people have written. Others take more stock in what the Bible has to say and use the dates in the Bible. And so you'll see a little variance even among your conservative scholars, so don't let that bother you a whole lot. When you see hundreds of years, then you need to take warning. That was one of the Buchmann and a whole lot of the liberal theologians out of Germany started saying that the Bible really wasn't written by the people that we had thought for 1900 years. It was written by, they came up with different dates. And so a lot of times when you get these real scholarly commentaries and papers and so forth, they'll start talking about these different folks who supposedly wrote the Old Testament. Just throw that out. That is just, it's just, as Freddie Clayton would say, hogwash. But now this, and like I said, don't get too beat up. I always remember the dates, 606, 596, and 586 as the departing of Israel. And you notice that this man has 537 talking about the first return, and that's fine. I have, 538, 535. It's not a big deal. But I wanted you to see that Nebuchadnezzar will attack Jerusalem in 606, and he'll take away Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, the princes of the people, the very best of the best. And then 10 years later, he'll take away another group, the biggest part, and then he will absolutely raise Jerusalem in 586 and take everybody that's left over there. And so it's important to know those things, because we're going to look tonight in the book of Ezra, and you're going to see some references to Jeremiah. You have to remember, these books are not chronologically arranged. What do we mean by that? Some of them didn't happen before others, okay? When you're reading the book of Genesis and you see, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, it's important for you to remember Moses is writing that, okay? And Moses lived 500 years after Abraham. Okay, so remember when that was written. It's talking about an earlier time, but it was written at a latter time. Now, these books of the history, the prophets fit into the books of history. You have to spend some time with it to become comfortable with it. But have you been reading in the books of Acts, and it talks about the church at Corinth being established? Or Paul going to Thessalonica? Or Paul, going over and spending time in Ephesus? And you'll notice that those are talking about churches that later on you will read letters about. And so realize that, the way the New Testament is arranged, and this is important. Try not to lose me on this. The first 5 books of the law, you have 12 historical books, and then you have 17 books written by men that we call the prophets. It grows from Isaiah all the way through Malachi. They're not chronologically arranged. Some of those major prophets that we talk about, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, they're writing at times, and you can take those minor prophets and you can stick them there with those major prophets. They're not arranged in how they were written, okay? So don't let that really threw me for a long time. I couldn't understand, how could the book of Ezra be talking about Jeremiah and his book ain't even there yet? Well, Jeremiah had written before, and Ezekiel was going to write before Ezra. And Daniel, of course, is living in the same place that Ezra is going to be coming from. And so Ezra, the scribe, the first 6 chapters of his book are talking about something that happened 80 years before he came on the scene. He's writing about a fellow by the name of Zerubbabel. Now, you say that 3 times fast and see if your jaws don't hurt. He's going to be the governor, the leader that's going to bring this first group of people back from Babylon. So notice in that chart you have there, you have the 70 years of captivity that was spoken of by the prophet Jeremiah. We'll pay a little bit more attention to that in a moment. Then we're going to have these 3 returns. Okay, the first one is going to be under this fellow Zerubbabel, Ezra chapters 1 through 6. We're going to finally catch Ezra's time when he's going to be writing about himself, verses 7 through 10. It's also believed that Ezra was probably the scribe that wrote the Chronicles. We have 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Just remember, it used to be one book. Ezra and Nehemiah was just one book. It's been divided later in the way that we set up our Bibles. Don't be frustrated with that. It's nothing to get bent out of shape about. But notice how many come back in that first wave. About 47,000 people are going to return. Cyrus is the king, and they're going to come back to resettle. They're going to restart everything, jumpstart, try to. And you think about how many people lived in Jerusalem at one time, and now how many are going to go back and try to restart that. And think of the dangers and things that would have come with that, and we'll talk about more of that. But they're not welcome. People are already there, don't like the idea that they're having to move out. Have you ever heard of the Palestinians? Do you know how their great love for Israel today? What is all that about? Well, you've got a nation that's being given land by a governments, and they're displacing the people who already live there. And for the last, what year was that, 1948 or something, that Israel became a nation? So that's been what, 52, and then 62, 71. Man, I added that on the fly. I didn't even take off my shoes. They've been doing what? Hating each other's guts, trying to kill each other, and trying to run each other off that land for years. And that will continue. So that's the environment. Think of that type of environment that the Jews are going to go back into. And it's during the time of Ezra's time when they start to be called Jews. Now, it was not a derogatory term. It simply meant the people of Judah, or Judah is how they would say it. And so, we'd say Americans, we're from America. And so it was just simply an abbreviated form of Judah. Those folks are the people of Judah, or the Jews. That's how they said that. So, if you referred to Abraham wasn't a Jew. It'd be hundreds of years later before they'd be referred to. The second return, of course, we looked at is Ezra. Kings have changed. People die, right? You have a fellow by the name of Artaxerxes, and you're going to see it's a very small amount of people, 1,754 men. You throw women and children with that, and you're probably looking at, 5,500 people. They're to come back and to teach the law. and that's what Ezra's desire is going to be. And of course, you have the Reformation, you have temple worship, and the revival that we're going to see, and God's people are going to try to get it together. And then the third return is under Nehemiah, and it's the same king. Don't know how long, probably think how many went with him, but he went back for the purpose of rebuilding the wall. Walled cities in that time were walled for a reason, and that is because people would come in and take what was yours. They rebuild the wall, and so that gives them some security, and then Nehemiah is going to have to come back. Now, if you'll notice on the back side of that, this is just simply one of the little study helps in what's called the Dixon Bible. It was a pretty popular Bible among brethren years ago. In fact, a lot of preachers used to sell the old Dixons, but just kind of just gives you a breakdown of the book of Ezra. And remember, the temple that they build in the day of Ezra is not going to be the temple that Jesus goes to, okay? The Greeks are going to destroy that temple about 200 years before the Christ. All right, so as you know today, Jerusalem is not a very stable place. It wasn't a very stable place back then either. So about 200 years before the Christ will be destroyed, then a fellow by the name of Herod, King Herod, is going to be rebuilding that. Remember when Jesus says, you'll tear down this temple, I'll build it back in 3 days? And they said, Herod's been building this thing 47 years and it ain't finished. You know, and you're going to do it in 3 days? Of course, he was talking about his body. But that Solomon's porch, Herod's temple, what the Romans will raise in AD 70, destroy, they wasn't the same temple. And so there's a kind of an outline. If you just want to kind of stick that in your Bible and bring that back with you, we'll kind of go back to and look at it from time to time. All right. With that being said, notice Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Well, now what are you talking about? What did Jeremiah have to say? Well, we turn over to the book of Jeremiah. And I had that marked earlier, but the little card I was using fell out. So we will turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 25. And you notice I am going old school. I thought it'd be good to spend some time with the onion skin. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 12. Jeremiah prophesies, and it shall come to pass. Now remember, this is what Daniel's reading. When Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 goes, lo and behold, he started adding up and says what? Oh, it's about time to go back. It's been about 70 years. Remember that wonderful prayer that he gives in the first part of chapter 9? Where he talks about how they've sinned. This is what he was reading. And it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and I will take it, or I will make it a perpetual desolation. That is what happens in Daniel chapter 5 when you have that fella. Remember his name? I do not remember his name. It was something bubble. Belshazzar, was it Belshazzar? Who was in Daniel chapter 5? I'm going to have to go look, aren't I? He was one of the grandsons of Belshazzar, the writing on the wall. Remember? Your kingdom's been found wanting. It's been weighed, it's been come up empty, and it's going to be removed from you. And that night, the Medes displaced the Babylonian kingdom, and so you have the beginning of what we would call the Medo-Persian kingdom. The Medes are not as strong as the Persians, and the Persians will quickly swallow up the Medes. And then you have this fellow by the name of Cyrus that we're reading about. So he says, I will raise up the spirit. Notice, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, and he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, now putting something in writing is a big deal. How do we know that? Well, God had, Cyrus here puts it in writing. But if you've got a land dispute or you have a property dispute, what ends that dispute? It's the evidence. It's that which is written down. Not only that, but do you remember an interesting point made in the book of Esther? Because the king, who has been kind of had his hood winked, had the hood put over his face, he was tricked into signing a proclamation. And when a Persian king signed a proclamation, what had to happen to it? Could you change it? Yeah, that's exactly right. Remember the king that had Daniel thrown in the lion's den? He didn't want that to happen. He was like, oh no, I don't want to do that. And what did all those men tell him? Oh, king, you wrote it down. You wrote it down, and the law of the Medes cannot be broken, the Medes and the Persians. So they had to stick with it. So when Cyrus writes this down, it's entered into the public record, and that's a great thing for the Jews, because 80 years from now, we're going to have to dig those records back up, because all of the enemies are going to be saying, hey, they don't need to be doing that. You need to quit doing that. And then they go back and make a search, and lo and behold, Darius, the Persian king, finds that indeed Cyrus did exactly that. And they found it in some old place. They didn't have hard drives back then. Can you believe that? Hey, guys, side note here. We'll take a break for just a moment. Does anybody, no, you kids don't. I saw a picture. It was a card. Remember the card catalogs in the library? Can you believe, Anise, that we did that at one time? That is absolutely mad. For you young folks, they used to have these, if you went to the Chattanooga Library, oh man, it had to be 40 foot long. They had 3 of them. And you'd have to go in these little boxes under A, B, C, D, and they had so many that you'd have to look under what A, you know, and you'd pull out these cards, and it was hundreds of cards, and in there, you know what they had on them? A number that you had to match with what floor and what shelf, and, you know, and go and find the book that you were looking for. Most of you now, you just Google. You don't even go find a book because it's already there. It is really wonderful times. Well, King Cyrus, Darius the Mede's not going to be able to do that. He couldn't do that. Cyrus is not going to be able to do that. And the king in Nehemiah's day, they're going to have to look for that record. Notice what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord God of heaven. Notice that's Jehovah. That's the covenant name of God. Now, brethren, there's a good chance that Cyrus was not a believer in the God of heaven like we might think a person is a believer. Because Cyrus let everybody go home. The whole thing, they had, whatever religion, whatever country you had came from, he gave them the right to go home. A lot of the old commentators will tell you that Cyrus became a believer, but you know, that's kind of hard to see, even though he says some great things. But the people, they were real okay with everybody's God, and they would put your God in their Parthenon of gods, and they would be respectful of your gods. You know, the gods that Artemis, she would be well respected by all the Zeus lovers at another town, if you will. They would not desecrate her or say anything bad about her. They knew you had your gods, they had their gods, and they'd be respectful of your gods and expected you to be respectful of their gods. That's why in the first century, when you had this group of people that came along who said, no, we will not acknowledge Caesar as God. We will not accept your gods. There is but one God. So they had always thought that the Jews were a little strange in doing that. They were what's called monotheistic, where they were polytheistic. Anybody, we worship whatever God. We'll be respectful of whatever God. Jews kind of did it on the down low, but what did the Christians do? Well, they went into all the world and said, what? There's one God. And he had a son, Jesus Christ. And they gave their lives for that message. And you know what Jesus said about that? You keep doing it. You be faithful unto death, because that was the message that turned the world upside down. Brethren, nowadays we need to think about, are we turning the world upside down? Because I know that when you go to work and you hear what's being said, you know the truth. You know, if you'll be quickly ostracized, you'll be quickly recognized as that person's just strange. Like Peter would say, they're going to find it odd that you don't run with them. How is it that you can not accept when two people love each other, no matter what sex they are or what they identify as? Why would you tell a young man that he can't use the young lady's restroom? They would think that that would be foreign. You know, a lot of folks today are just throwing all of that out and saying you can't be unkind and unloving and as children of God. Well, we realize that's exactly right. And so Cyrus, the king of Persia, says, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. And he ain't bragging there. He's telling it like it is. We'll see Artaxerxes, who's going to be Esther's husband, has 127 provinces. Just about everything that you can think of besides Greece. He kind of has it handed to him there at a place called Thermopylae, and turns back his 1,000,000-man army, and that's one of the reasons he's having that drunken feast in Ezra chapter 1. But they pretty much owned everything besides Greece, the known world. Very powerful. He hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. So not only is Zerubbabel going to send them back, allow them to go back, but he's going to give them money to go, if you will. He says, who is there among you of all his people? In other words, whoever of you, God be with you. and let you go up to Jerusalem. If you want to, you go up, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel, which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place, in other words, folks that don't go with you, let them at least share in your sojourn. Let the men of his place help him with silver, gold, goods, beasts, and so forth, free will offerings of the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. Here you have people who've been living in foreign land 70 years. Chances are their parents were the ones that lived there, and now they've heard about this their whole life, and now they have an opportunity to go. Think of just think of what all that involves. Nowadays, when I think about picking up and moving to the other side of the country, what do the people in California speak? Or let's not use California. What do the people in Missouri or Wyoming speak? Well, they speak English. That wouldn't be a big deal, would it? But you're going to go through all these various nations who don't know you, who don't like you, who wonder why you're there, and you're traveling 50,000 people in a caravan. And most people are not, travelers by nature. We build houses. We're kind of like that. Any of y'all ever heard of a group called the Donner Group? D-O-N-N-E-R. They were, oh my goodness, if you ever want to read a Greek tragedy, it was just awful. They try to go, we call them pioneers. They set out for the West. Well, most people who set out for the West, they're not really pioneers. Yes, they were pioneers and they went there, but these were not mountain men and guys who went out and wrestled bears and, these were, Eastern United States shopkeepers and stuff who moved out and the hardships that they went through. And now think about leaving your nation that you grew up in. You're a Chaldean as you can be. You've seen all the idols. Your parents have tried to keep the God of Israel in your life, but all of that it's just now you're going to go and do that. How scary that must have been. This is not a small thing. It would have taken at least 4 months just to have made the journey from point A to point B. And when you get to point B, there is no, Pepper Tree, or there is no Hyatt. There is no, there's not even a Motel 6. When you get there, you're going to have to make a life for yourself. It says, then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah. Now that'd be the patriarchs, if you will, chiefs of the fathers. And they're going to say, let's do this. And so folks go, but people, brethren, there was probably 50 to 60,000, maybe more, that came out of Jerusalem to Chaldea. If you just kind of multiply that, there were probably hundreds of thousands of Jews, probably close to 1 million, that had migrated, were part of the Chaldean, and just had a small group come back. Notice Benjamin, and there were people of Judah and Benjamin. Of course, you'd expect that. That was the two major tribes in the southern kingdom. And the priests and the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised up to go and to build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. Why did they go? God had put a fire in their bellies, if you will. When I, brethren, think about the Puritans and what they did, I don't even like going on cruises. And I mean big ships, I don't like that. She likes that, so I have to go. So, I don't like that because bad things happen in the sea. And the Mayflower that we talk about, back in that time, the travel, it was awful. I mean, they lost ships. People died just on the, getting there. And not to mention everything that they went through, the sacrifice that was made. And but think of the spirit that burned in them to go and to do that. And so they go and they start the process. They were about of them strengthen their hand, gave them money, gave them precious things. Also Cyrus the king brings his treasurer in and has him count out all the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple 60, 70, 50 years earlier. And this guy's name is Mithridath, the treasurer, and he's going to number them to a fellow by the name of Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And the number of them, if you add up all these numbers, you see it doesn't come out to the grand total. You're given, what is the first thing, 30 pieces of gold, silver chargers, 20 knives, and so forth. There's some debate on what that word knife means. We don't really know. So 20 of something. 30 basins of gold, silver basins, and so you see all that. But if you add it up, it doesn't add up to the 5,400 things of verse 11. And why is that? If you were doing an inventory and you got all these miscellaneous things laying around, you'd probably count the big stuff, the real important stuff, and you'd just say, I'll just put that in a box, and take that with you. You may have a general count, but so that isn't written down there, so don't get too beat up by that. And then in chapter 2, the whole chapter basically is dedicated to the Allen family went, and the Morris family went, and the Gilbert family went. This is who the male was. And so you run down this list. The two that jump out at you, verse 2, is Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And the reason those two men are significant and first is the fact one's going to be the leader, the governor, and the other one is going to be the high priest. Now that Nehemiah listed third there, don't let that throw you off. That is not the Nehemiah of whose book we're going to read. He won't come for years later. Now, if you'll look at the end of that list, we're not going to read down through that. That's tremendous people who would go and do that. But in verse 55, notice the children of Solomon's servants, the children of Sotai, the children of, and goes on through. And then notice in verse 59, we're starting to run into some discrepancies now. People hear that this is going on, and so they want to go. And some of them have Jewish heritage, but they've lived in other towns. They've not lived in Babylon. Notice, went up from Tel Melah and Tel Harsa and Cherub, and notice the qualifying statement, but they could not show their father's house and their seed. The Jews kept meticulous records of genealogies. The family Bible, you have the tree in the front, which I have got to go talk to one of my aunts because, I'm going to lose all that information if I don't have the wherewithal to go get that. But we like to look at that. We like to look at our heritage. We like to see where we're from. And so they kept that pretty meticulous. And the reason they're doing that, why would they be worried about what tribe you're from? Anybody. Looking for a Messiah, that's exactly right. But not only that, who's going to offer up that animal? Got to be a priest. Done ran across that once. We ain't going to do it again. They're going to keep good records. Those records are forever destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. Jews today cannot tell you where they come from. If you hear somebody named Cohen, that is the Hebrew word for priest, and chances are somewhere down the line, someone tried to say, hey, we were priests, so they took on that name, but they can't prove that today, and that's one of the reasons there's not going to be a rebuilding of the temple and all that other stuff that many of our denominational friends want to tell us. This gets more important, though. Here these people say, hey, we want to go, and they say, okay, they're not mentioned again, so they probably do go. There's strength in numbers, but when it gets really critical, notice verse 61, the children of the priests, and they named some of the priests which took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, which was called after the name. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore were they as polluted from the priesthood. So they make the decision that we're not going to allow them, verse 63, eat of the most holy things till there stood up a priest with the Urim and the Thummim. Probably that was destroyed. And so when they got back to Jerusalem and restart worship and so forth, they can make another. And the Urim and Thummim, if you remember, just a couple of stones that the priest would use to talk to God. You might say that sounds like it's kind of weird. That was the way it was done. You remember David would have the priests come with the Urim and Thummim, and God would talk to David through. We have that confirmed in Scripture. We're going to stop here because I know we've got a busy night and I don't want to go over. So we'll stop here. But the one thing that I wanted you to see that's stressed here, they're going to go back and they're going to reestablish. They're going to have a reformation, if you will. But this time, they're not just going to be frivolous. They've realized why they're in Babylon. And so when it comes to things like what family you're from, whether or not you're going to be a priest or not, they're going to be concerned about such things. They're going to make sure that only the people that are supposed to be there are doing those things. And you're going to see at times, during this little brief history we're going to be talking about 80 years, that the Jews are going to be real zealous, and then it's going to kind of fade a little bit. And they're going to marry strange women, do things they shouldn't be doing, do stuff on the Sabbath they're not supposed to be doing. And then you'll have a leader rise up, kind of get them straight again, and then they'll kind of, go back into that again. And brethren, there's a lesson there for us. You're not going to be able to go through this life with your hair on fire all the time being the greatest Christian ever. Life has twists, it has turns, it has all these things. Don't be frustrated with yourself when you find yourself in the valleys. There will be mountains. What we've got to do, though, is when we're in the valleys and we're having those struggles and those difficulties, is keep working. Keep getting up, keep looking forward, doing the things that we should. These were the people of God. And I think the thing that amazes me is God's saying, go back. Yet that going back ain't easy. They get back and they could get there and say, hey, all you, pagans, we're here now. And God, knock them dead. Tell them who we are. Doesn't happen. They've got to go in there. They've got to work the land. They've got to deal with folks who don't like them. God doesn't strike all those people dead. God doesn't make it an easy road. As a matter of fact, it's a very difficult road. The walls are torn down. They can't defend themselves. They're constantly being harassed by their enemies. The whole time, God is in this. But it's a work, man. It's a work. It's hard. People are threatening their lives. People are taking their stuff. Even their own countrymen. That's amazing to me. Nehemiah's really going to jump on them because their own countrymen start taking advantage of them. And he's saying, look, man, we're all in this together, and y'all are taking usury. You're making them sell their kids into slavery to you so you can make money off of them, and he'll rebuke that. And so just remember, when you're going through difficult times and you think, man, God must not love me, look at the people of Israel. Look at God's people when they came back. God's with them. But it is not an easy road to hoe. There's work to be done. And in our lives, there's a work. If your spouse is not a Christian, if people in your lives around you are not Christians, it's a work, it's a labor. Don't give up. Get frustrated. Yes, that happens. Don't let that wear on you. You just keep being what you ought to be, trying to be the absolute best example you can be. And from time to time, when you found yourself just, realize that's normal. That's perfectly normal. Just get back up. Start tomorrow fresh. God tells us, wait on the Lord. Sun will rise in the east, set in the west. It's another day. Have patience. Be faithful. Have patience. And if it doesn't go the way that you think it ought, remember Job. Remember these children of Israel. They had a plan. Woo, man, we're going back. Yay, don't you know the zeal for that? How everybody must have been so excited. And then they get there and it's not what you think. Sometimes when we're Christians and we're trying to live the life and it just doesn't go like we think, we can be discouraged. God's gave us all these examples. Hang in there. Be what you ought to be. If you're here tonight, you're not a New Testament Christian, let me encourage you. Man, we've talked about the fruits of the Spirit. We've talked about how we ought to think. We've all talked about how the spiritual clothes that we ought to wear. We've talked about the spiritual armor. Next week we're going to talk about love and how that kind of capstones it all. But those are not something that you can have and use in your repertoire if you're not a child of God. Let God help you. Obey the gospel. You know who Jesus is. You're willing to confess him before men that indeed he died, rose from the dead, and that he's the Son of God, willing to live your life as he would have you to live. Then why not put him on in baptism? Maybe in times past you have, but you've left your first love because, man, you got down in one of those valleys and just couldn't get out. And that's where you've been. Maybe you've been putting on a good face. Maybe you've been, hey, I get up every day, I wash my face, my hair, I'm doing the motions. But the zeal's gone. Rekindle that fire. Rekindle that fire. Remember, it's the nature of a fire to go out. You got to stir it up. That's what Paul would tell Timothy. If it's something of a public nature, by all means, we'll pray for you and with you. If it's something of a private nature, just recommit yourself. Be what you ought to be. Let us help you in any way that we can.